everybody, welcome back to my channel. If you have just joined us from the StudyTube project, then welcome. Come on in. If you haven't watched part 1 where I discuss the different hominins, then go and watch that video. It is linked in the pinned comment. It's on the StudyTube project. It went live this evening, but it would really help if you watched that first because it's a bit of context to this video. So this video is going to discuss both the biological evidence and the sort of sociological evidence and theories behind the possible evolution of language in humans, and I'm going to do it in chronological order so that it's a little bit easier to understand. Right, language. Now, language as we know it involves speech, actions, and also symbols in body language. The word symbols is key in this because in order to understand language, we have to understand symbols. Letters are symbols for sounds. So if we don't understand that things can mean something, things can be symbolic for something, then we can't understand language. That's the general theory behind it anyway. What I've kind of looked at in this is where we first see symbols in the archaeological record. So first things first, let's look at the social side of things, and I'm going to start with a paper by Ilo and Dunbar from 1993, and essentially what they say is that as group size got bigger, so did brain size, because it was a direct correlation as you basically needed to interact more with other people, and as your group gets bigger you need more of a brain capacity, more ability to communicate in order to keep order, kind of form a hierarchy and maintain social cohesion. Now if we look at animals in big groups, we can see that they definitely communicate to each other. Vervet monkeys in particular are an animal that uses different sounds to distinguish between different predators. This leads us into the biggest question of this whole video and, well, the whole topic in general. What does language actually mean? It's a completely open question, but it can define your answer to this whole debate. So we're going to head back to Dunbar, but this time to 2017, where he suggested that there will be a direct link between time invested in relationships and the functionality of that relationship, with an emphasis on communication and verbal communication at that. Dunbar points out that with the emergence of fire, for example, groups will be staying up longer, sitting around the hearth, trying to get warm, socialising, and you're going to need verbal communication in the dark to reach those at the back of the circle if they're not in front of the flames. So the more people in your group, the more likely you are to need verbal communication, and the more time you put into that relationship with the group, the more functional the group is going to be. Now, a lot of people came back to this sort of idea and said, well, what triggered the language? People didn't just start talking, did they? You know, was there a set time? People were just like, oh, I can speak now. Well, Dunbar says we don't necessarily need a language trigger because laughter came before language and just evolved sort of slowly into it. He explains that at the time of Homo Heidelbergensis 500,000 years ago, there is evidence of controlled use of fire and also evidence of breath control, and therefore the ability to be kind of articulate in verbal communication. That's not saying that these hominins were able to form full sentences, but the ability to at least control sort of what came out of their mouth and form a more complex syntax than, say, a dog just barking. Some actual real evidence for this supposed breath control is in Turkana. Now, Turkana is here. He is a Homo erectus specimen from around 1.6 million years ago. Now, Turkana supposedly had a developed thoracic nerve bundle, which carries nerve signals from the spine, the spinal cord, to the rest of the body, but mainly the chest and abdomen, so it helps with breath control and, you know, regulation of breathing. Anthropologists have been able to deduce this from the fossilized evidence of the vertebrae. However, his are slightly narrower than in anatomically modern humans, meaning it was unlikely that he could make complex speech and sentences. The fact that he actually had a moderately developed thoracic nerve bundle suggests that the adaptation was already starting in Homo erectus. Now, Morgan et al. 2015 looked into the possibility of verbal communication in teaching of stone tool technologies and the skills involved with knapping, which is the process of like making stone tools, flaking. The group ran an experiment with 184 adult participants, obviously modern adults, so it's not quite as applicable because our brains are developed differently to those that the model is trying to represent. But anyway, he looked at 5 different transition teaching methods, including gestural teaching, just full talking, and he looked at how different modes of lithics, so stone tools, could be taught to essentially the next generation. So how did parents or group leaders teach the younger members to make their stone tools? Morgan et al. Were looking at mode 1 lithics, or older one lithics, which is the oldest type of stone tools, the most sort of basic form. This is them. Older one stone tools take 1, 2, 3 hits. Older one tools are arguably not sort of pre-planned. They're usually made from materials that are local and involve only up to 15 minutes of hitting in order to get a point. They're not shaped really, they're just pointy and sharp and functional. Morgan et al. Deduced that in order to pass on the skills needed to make older one tools, you had to have some form of low fidelity social transmission. And this, they say, might be the reason that there was basically a stasis in these tools. They were the same for 700,000 years, almost exactly the same. So what you might deduce from this then is that there wasn't complex speech during this mode of lithic, because if you could make more complex tools, if you could explain, why don't we do it like this, let's cut off an extra bit, why would they be the same for 700,000 years? However, for mode 2 tools, or Acheulean tools, which look like this, Morgan et al. Explained that it is much more likely that you would need verbal communication. Acheulean stone tools came in around 1.8 million years ago, the same time as Homo erectus pretty much, and because of that, you know, perhaps that means Homo erectus had some form of better communication. Could we link that to the fact that Turkana boy had his thoracic nerve bundle? I'm not sure we'll ever know, to be honest, but just presenting different arguments. So keeping with Homo erectus, it has been said that perhaps we would have needed some form of language to actually leave Africa, you know, to discuss it, I guess. Now, in the Isles of Flores, there has also been a tooth which is very similar to that of Homo erectus found. Now, these islands have never had a land bridge, so some people have argued that, well, they must have had some form of complex communication, whether that's language or not, we don't know, but verbal communication would have been useful in order to build a boat, in order to get across the sea to actually get to the Isles of Flores. Now, these islands were populated by Homo floresiensis. This is a picture of this one. It is a separate species with possible links to Homo erectus, but essentially people are arguing, well, how did they get there without talking to each other? I'm gonna leave that one completely open-ended for you to judge. Now, moving forward a little bit in time, we come to Homo heidelbergensis. So remember, this is around 800,000 to 200,000 years ago. So we are looking particularly at Spain in a region called Atapuerca and a site called Cima de la Hueso. It basically means pit of the bones. Creepy. So we're coming back to this guy. Remember him? This is Cranium 5. Great name. So this guy had very similar vocal tract proportions to this Neanderthal, Laferisi 1, whom authors had already suggested perhaps had vocal tracts that could generate sounds that we recognise today. This Neanderthal skull here, Laferisi 1, is the most complete Neanderthal skull ever found, and it has a capacity of over 1,600 centimetres cubed. We're going to come back to Laferisi in a second, but I'm just going to continue talking about Heidelbergensis so that it remains chronological for now. There's also been some debate about whether we can look at handedness in order to assess the presence of language, because with handedness comes lateralization of the brain, and with lateralization of the brain comes the capacity for language. Lateralization is controlled by the Broca's area, which is at the front, and it has even been suggested that some hominins as early as 1.4 million years ago had evidence of different sides of the brain. Neanderthals almost certainly did, as did Homo heidelbergensis. Frey et al. Have also gone so far as to suggest that 93.1% of Homo heidelbergensis skeletons showed evidence of right-handedness, and they've done this by looking at scratch marks on the teeth from possibly, like breaking bark off twigs and sharpening things. Just the way that it's pulled on the tooth, they've used that as a suggestion for right-handedness. I'm pretty sure they've compared this to modern apes. It's not just a shot in the dark. But again, that's something to think about. If they had this capacity for handedness, it does suggest the lateralization of the brain and the use of the Broca's area, which could in turn suggest the capability for language. Whether or not that's complex is a completely different complexity of discussion. So generally it has been suggested that where Homo heidelbergensis may have had the brain capabilities for language, or at least some form of verbal communication, the laryngeal air sacs, which allow speech of certain sounds and like certain vowels, have not been present, or there's been no evidence of them available. However, at Symbolism, apparently there is. So perhaps certain groups had a mutation or just a need for this evolution earlier than everyone else. Surely it's got to have happened somewhere. It's not just a case of every Homo heidelbergensis just suddenly had it switched on. It must have started somewhere. So perhaps it was here. Or perhaps we just haven't found evidence anywhere else yet. So now we're staying in Atapuerca, but we're moving on from Homo heidelbergensis to Homo neanderthalensis. The time period is around 430,000 years ago, and this is very early Neanderthal behaviour. So these Neanderthals have been said to have the same outer middle ear bandwidth as modern humans, giving them the ability to hear the same sounds that we can hear now. But while a human-like sound sensitivity might suggest that they have to pick up voices from each other in the community, it doesn't necessarily mean they actually had language. However, it is interesting that it's these Neanderthals that have been picked up for this, after their ancestors, the Homo heidelbergensis, also had the possible capabilities for language. Perhaps it really did evolve here. Moving to France and back to Le Ferrici 1, this is another really interesting Neanderthal skeleton. So the hyoid bone of the Le Ferrici 1 Neanderthal is said to have fallen into the same position range as modern humans. The hyoid bone is one of the ones in here, so it helps to control the movement of air, which enables the voice. Similarly to Atapuerca with their Homo heidelbergensis, the Le Ferrici 1 Neanderthal has been said to be able to hear the full range of human language and speech sounds. The larynx height index, the larynx is the voice box, is also said to be within the same range as a modern human 10-year-old. And seen as modern human 10-year-olds can make the full range of human sounds at this age, it has been deduced that the Neanderthals too must have been able to make the full range of human sounds, including certain vowels which previously by writers such as Stephen Myvan have been said to not have been able to come out of a Neanderthal's mouth. This study was by Boy et al. And it has been critiqued for not looking at the hyoid bone. However, the study by Barney et al. 2012, where they found that the hyoid bone was in the same position, does help this and back it up. There is, however, some contention in this, and there will always be contention in this because it is such a complex subject area that we really can't ever know everything about because we don't have the evidence here. Lieberman does critique this by saying that while Homo heidelbergensis and Neanderthals' vocal tract might be complete and similar to what we have now, we can never be certain of speech because it comes from the brain mechanism. He does also argue that the angle of the supralaryngeal airway, which is basically your throat, is not right to be able to pronounce the vowel sounds that the other writers said that they could. So it's very contested. I'm pretty sure it was Lieberman as well who said that Neanderthal supralaryngeal airway was angled in the same sort of way as that of an animal who has to stop itself from being able to breathe while eating. So dogs, for example, their mouth is shaped a certain way that means they can eat and drink as fast as they can without breathing, so that it stops food going down the wrong hole. We don't have that as a species, but he suggests that Neanderthals did have that, which then in turn would mean that they can't formulate quite the same amount of complex speech or sounds as we can. I'm going to move a little bit more into a social and cognitive sort of psychological aspect of this, and that is about working memory capacity. So Wynne and Coolidge 2004 argue that Neanderthals used long-term working memory like we do today, and they did this for lithic production, stone tool production. So Neanderthals made a mode 3 technology. So we've talked about modes 1 and 2, Oldowan and Acheulean. Mode 3 is called Levallois. And Neanderthals had their own kind of Levallois technology called Mousterian. Now Levallois technology is more 3D, it has a certain aspect of extra planning because you have to visualise all the different angles. It's not a single surface face, which what that means is you have to have pictured it in your head. You have to be able to form an image, a three-dimensional image in your mind that you can virtually twist around in all directions to be able to plan what you're going to do and how you are going to make it, what techniques you used previously to do that. And what Wynne and Coolidge are essentially saying is this technology fits Erikson's idea of long-term working memory, and it also suggests an aspect of phonological storage. Now phonological storage is one of the systems associated with long-term working memory, and their hypothesis was that a mutation to this system might have allowed language development. Phonological storage involves the ability to be syntactically complex, including different sentence types such as commands and questions, and to be able to distinguish between the two. What Wynne and Coolidge are essentially saying is that if Neanderthals had the ability to use long-term working memory for their tools, why couldn't they have also used it for language? That point is a massive one for the symbolism argument, because a lot of more older scholars, I would say, have suggested that Neanderthals don't have the capacity to understand symbols. However, if they are able to formulate a picture in their mind, then that is a symbol, is it not? They're forming a symbol of what they're going to make in their heads before they're making it. And it is that representation, you are able to formulate a representation of something out of thin air in your brain and then turn it into something that represents what's in your head. And that is symbol recognition. So it fits into the whole understanding of symbols in order to understand language. It does appear though that there aren't many other identifications of symbolism in the Neanderthal record. Possibly, depends how you take the definition of symbolism. There's certainly not the same amount of art and crafts evidenced from anatomically modern human periods. Art as like a non-functional sort of paintings and little figurines. However, just because evidence doesn't stand the test of time, and just because there is an absence of evidence, doesn't mean that there is evidence for absence. And that is a key phrase in archaeology that you need to remember. It is quite possible that Neanderthals used flowers and decorated their living spaces with things that would have perished and that we're never going to find. A really interesting site actually is at Shanadar Cave in Israel, where there are Neanderthal burials with possible like flower pollen in the graves. So some people have argued that, oh, they must have put flowers on their dead, you know, made offerings, left things that would have suggested that they can understand symbols, ritualistic behaviour. It's also possible that flowers were put there to ward off smells, so maybe it's less symbolic. There has as well been an argument that these bits of pollen were brought in both by the workers' boots on the dig and by rodents. So it's a very contested piece, but it's quite possible. Another interesting site is Maastricht Belvedere, I think that's how you say it, in the Netherlands, where evidence of red ochre and yellow ochre were found in Neanderthal contexts. And this find of red ochre in the Netherlands pushes back the use of red ochre by Neanderthals back to around 200 to 250,000 years, which is the same as its use in the African record by humans. What's interesting about ochre is that it is a pigment, so it can be used as body paint, as wall paint. It is the main source of red and yellow paint in cave art. It's quite possible that Neanderthals were painting their bodies. And if they were painting their bodies, this is a form of symbolic behaviour, is it not? Someone, I can't remember who it is, but argued, oh, it might be sun cream, but I don't know, I personally think that's ridiculous. If someone is painting themselves, choosing to paint themselves in red, black and yellow paint, this to me seems to be more of a symbolic or artistic behaviour. Perhaps it's ritualistic, perhaps it just symbolises a group mentality, you know, like a tattoo does now. Either way, it suggests capability of understanding symbolism, which in turn suggests capability of language. In Spain, at Cueva de los Aviones, yeah, that's the right one, has red pigment ochre has also been found, and yellow pigment, on shells. My final point for Neanderthals just comes from Stephen Mythen, and that is we're going back to Shanidar Cave, which is the same one where the burials were found with flowers. But there was one particular burial at Shanidar Cave who's known as Shanidar Man. Now, Shanidar Man was pretty crippled. He had been potentially in a landslide or a crush. Half of his body was very badly injured. However, his injuries are not death injuries. They're partially healed at least, so he will have needed care. There is no way that he could have cared for himself. And my point to you there is, will they have needed language to be able to communicate with this poor man as he was needing help? Do you think that vocal communication would have helped that? Do we need it, or could it have just been gestural? Do you think it's complex? What Stephen Mythen suggests is perhaps the Neanderthals had some form of comforting vocab, so maybe they hummed. This is from his book, The Singing Neanderthals. He suggests that Neanderthals maybe had like a type sound that they used as a comforting behaviour, perhaps parents to children, but they also might have used it on Shanidar Man. And enter you guys, the Homo Sapiens. Now we know that Homo Sapiens can talk, right? We have, generally anyway, the ability to speak, to use language in all different languages. But what we don't know is when this started. Did the first ever Homo sapien have the ability to speak? Or did it get turned on kind of halfway through? So in Africa, Homo sapiens were using ochre around 200,000 years ago, but two very interesting African sites called Blombos Cave and Kebera Cave had even more interesting evidence of symbolism. Lots of mollusk shells, for example, at Blombos Cave had been transported almost 90 kilometers from the coast and contained holes. So they were all perforated shells which possibly could have been used for jewellery. Either way, they'd been transported and had some form of deeper meaning. Why else would you transport little shells from a beach all the way inland for 90 kilometers unless there was some form of ritual, symbolic-y, very interesting behaviour? I don't know. So at around 40,000 years ago, we have what is called the Upper Palaeolithic starting. That is kind of the European term. It's not really used in Africa, but in Europe anyway, we have the Upper Palaeolithic, and this is where we start to see cave art. It's also where we pretty much got just Homo sapiens left. So the Neanderthals have almost all died out by now, and there's a small pocket still in Spain, but the majority have gone. So what these more obvious displays of art in terms of what we might call art show at caves such as Ruffignac and Lascaux is that people, early Homo sapiens in 40,000, 30,000 years ago, really thinking they must have been trained in this. You know, we teach art now and likely share what they've drawn. Like, we share what we've drawn. We tell people what we want to draw. We come up with plans, ideas, and what's to say they weren't doing the same thing? It's also very likely that with artworks such as these, including this Lion Man, which I think is really cool, is that people were almost certainly involved in ritual behaviour, and ritual behaviour tends to involve some form of verbal language. It has been suggested possibly that this sort of jump might be because of a brain size shift. For example, Schultz et al. Suggests that around 100,000 years ago there was an obvious brain size shift. I don't think we've found enough skeletons to really say this is a definite jump yet, and I'm not sure we ever will, but it's the best sort of thing we've got to discuss language is by looking at these evidences of symbolism. Now, finally, just before we end, I'm going to add in that there is a potential gene for language called FOXP2. I'm pretty sure this has all but been dismissed now, but certain people suggested that the existence of the FOXP2 gene arrived with language in human form. Now, the FOXP2 gene was found 49,000 years ago at Elsidron in a human skeleton, and that is one person's idea of when language first evolved, was when this gene came about, but this one is very heavily contested. And we have come to the end of this video. I've worked all the way up to Homo Sapiens. Hopefully it was easy enough to understand. If you have any questions, then do let me know in the comments, but all of the references will be in the pinned comment, along with my experience of my dig at Cima de las Palomas, which is where this site was. I vlogged my whole trip, and you'll get to see how archaeology kind of works, how Paleolithic and human evolution archaeology works in the field. So that will be linked in the pinned comment. Definitely go have a look at that because it's pretty interesting and I'm quite proud of it, and it was a great time. If you would like more videos on human evolution, then do give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed, and subscribe to the Study 2 project and my channel if you're interested in more content.